Hey guys, tonight we are stepping into something that feels suspiciously familiar, a world of whisper campaigns, reputation destruction, and information warfare that required no Wi-Fi, no smartphones, and absolutely no accountability. We're talking about the gossip networks that ran 1960s suburban America, specifically the ones that quietly controlled, surveilled, and occasionally destroyed the women who lived inside them. Not the fun kind of gossip. Not the, did you hear about Karen's new haircut? I mean the organised, systematic, almost professionally structured social web of information sharing that decided who got invited to the block party, whose husband was really working late, and whose daughter was becoming a problem. Before we go any further, a huge genuine thank you to the viewer who suggested this one. You clearly know exactly what kind of content keeps people up at night, and somehow also helps them fall asleep. That tension is what this channel is built on, and I truly appreciate you being part of it. If you enjoy what I do here, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is. Also, the channel is now live on Spotify. There's a link in the description if you'd like to listen that way, but only if you actually enjoy this. No pressure, truly. Now, dim those lights, pull up your softest blanket, turn on a fan for that background hum, and settle in. Because we are going somewhere quiet, manicured, and absolutely terrifying. Have you ever wondered what it was actually like to live inside a 1960s American suburb? Did the women there like it? Did they know they were being watched? Was there a hierarchy? Who was at the top of it, and what did they do with that power? Could you be erased from the neighbourhood social register just for wearing the wrong shade of lipstick to a Tuesday coffee? Was there an official meeting, or did it just happen? Who was taking notes, and why does the whole system somehow remind you of a group chat you were mysteriously removed from in 2019? Congratulations, you've just woken up in 1962. The lawn is perfectly edged. Something is baking in a kitchen that isn't yours, and 3 houses down, someone is already talking about you. You could not have built a better gossip machine if you had tried. The post-war American suburb was, architecturally speaking, a masterpiece of involuntary transparency. Houses were close enough that you could hear your neighbour's screen door from your kitchen sink. Front lawns were open, unfenced, performative, little stages of respectability that faced the street and, more importantly, faced each other. Picture windows, those wide glass expanses that builders sold as a feature of modern living, turned every living room into a diorama. You were always, whether you knew it or not, on display, and someone was always watching the show. Think about what that actually means for a moment. You wake up in your 1960s ranch house. You pull back the curtains, and in doing so, you've just announced to the entire street that you are awake, that you are alive, and that your curtains were closed until this particular moment, which, depending on the hour, someone has already noted. This was not paranoia. This was the physical reality of a neighbourhood built with almost no privacy as a design principle. The developers who platted these communities after the war were not thinking about surveillance. They were thinking about community, about the appeal of openness, about the friendly, democratic feeling of a neighbourhood where everyone could see everyone. What they accidentally designed was a panopticon with better landscaping. The layout did the rest. Houses sat on narrow lots, driveways ran parallel, close enough that 2 women could have a full conversation from their respective cars without raising their voices. Kitchens were typically at the back of the house, facing the rear yard, which faced the rear yard of the house on the next street over, which means that from your kitchen window, you had a clear sight line into the private outdoor life of at least 2 other households. You were not spying, you were washing dishes, but you were also watching in the way that people who live in close proximity to each other have always watched, because information about your neighbours was genuinely useful. It told you whether the Hendersons had gotten home safely. It told you whether something looked wrong next door. It told you things you needed to know, and a few things you probably did not need to know, but were going to know anyway. The street itself was designed for walking, and walking the street was both exercise and reconnaissance. A woman pushing a stroller had a perfectly legitimate reason to move slowly, to glance, to observe. The car in the driveway at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. The window with the shade pulled at an unusual hour. The garden that had gone unattended for 3 weeks. These were data points, and in a community where women were home all day with significant time and significant social stakes, data points were currency. Modern life gives you a notification every time something wants your attention. The 1960s suburb gave you a window, a front porch, and a walking route, and relied on the entirely natural human instinct to pay attention to the people around you. It turns out that instinct, given the right architecture, is extremely efficient. You did not need an algorithm. You needed a picture window in a neighbourhood with no fences. The information generated itself, and once generated it needed somewhere to go. That is where the network came in. The suburb built the stage, the women built the theatre, and every morning, without a single meeting call to order, the performance continued. Every morning in kitchens across suburban America, a ritual was underway that looked, from the outside, like friendship. Women gathered over percolated coffee and store-bought crumb cake to exchange what they would have called conversation, and what historians might more accurately call raw intelligence. The coffee clatch, that informal rotating assembly of neighbourhood women, was the beating heart of the local information network. It had no agenda, no chair, and no minutes taken. It also had no mercy. What was shared before 9:30 in the morning could reshape a woman's social standing before noon. Picture the scene. It is 8:45 on a Wednesday. The children have been sent to school. The husband's car is gone. The dishes from breakfast are not yet done, or have been done already if you are the kind of woman who does dishes immediately, which itself is a data point. You put on a fresh housecoat or a day dress, depending on how seriously you take these things, and you walk, or are called, to a neighbour's kitchen, where the percolator is already going, and someone has put out a plate of something. This is the coffee clatch. It looks like a social visit. It functions like a morning briefing. The information exchanged at the coffee clatch covered everything, and it covered it fast. Who had a visitor last night that nobody recognised? Whose husband had come home looking upset? Whose child had said something strange at school? Whose house smelled of cigarettes when you dropped off the Tupperware? None of this was introduced as gossip. It was introduced as concern, as curiosity, as simply mentioning something. I don't want to say anything, but it was the phrase that opened approximately 40% of the most significant intelligence drops in suburban history. The other 60% began with, "You did not hear this from me." The coffee clatch had a social structure as real as any boardroom, even if it was never acknowledged as such. There was almost always a woman who hosted more than the others, which gave her a kind of quiet authority. Her kitchen was the venue, which meant she set the informal tone. There was the woman who brought information in reliably every time and was valued for it. There was the woman who was quieter, who listened more than she spoke, and who was either trusted completely or watched carefully depending on the group. And there was occasionally a newcomer, present on probation, being assessed in real time while being offered cake. What is remarkable about the coffee clatch, in retrospect, is not that women gossiped. People have always gossiped. What is remarkable is how organised it was without ever being organised. The same group, roughly the same time, roughly the same houses in rotation, sustained for years. It had the regularity of a standing meeting and the deniability of a casual drop-in. If anyone had ever suggested it was anything more than neighbours being friendly, everyone present would have been genuinely confused by the implication they were just having coffee, that the coffee came with a comprehensive audit of neighbourhood life was simply a coincidence of human nature and kitchen proximity. The crumb cake was real. The intelligence operation was also real. Both were excellent. When a new family moved onto the block, a delegation arrived within 48 hours bearing Casserole's telephone numbers and an agenda that nobody acknowledged out loud. The welcome wagon, both the official organisation and its unofficial local variations, was the suburb's intake process, a warmly packaged system for evaluating newcomers before deciding where they fit in the hierarchy. Were they our kind of people? Did she seem ambitious? Was his car nice enough, or suspiciously too nice? The casserole was real. The assessment was also real. And the report back to the neighbourhood was thorough. You are the new woman on the block. The moving truck left yesterday. Your boxes are not unpacked. You have not yet found the grocery store. And there is a knock at the door and 2 women are standing there smiling with covered dishes and the warm, practiced ease of people who have done this before. They are lovely. They bring you useful information, which paediatrician is good when the trash gets collected where the nearest church is. They ask questions that seem friendly and are also diagnostic. Where did you move from? Does your husband travel much? Do you have family nearby? These are not interrogation questions. They are orientation questions. They are also, quietly, profile questions, and the answers are being stored. The welcome wagon visit served the newcomer genuinely. It also served the neighbourhood, which needed to know what it was getting. In a community where social life was conducted at close range, and where one household's behaviour affected the texture of the entire block, a new arrival was a variable, potentially wonderful, potentially destabilising. The welcome visit was how the neighbourhood began its evaluation. You had maybe 45 minutes to make an impression, and the women visiting you were experienced readers of domestic environments, the state of your kitchen, the books on your shelf, whether you offered coffee in return and what kind of cups you used, whether your children were visible and well behaved, whether you seemed settled or scattered. All of it was noted, none of it was mentioned. The report back was delivered at the next coffee clatch, usually within 24 hours. I think she'll fit in was the highest available endorsement. Something like, she seems very nice, with a slight pause before the very could initiate a 6-month watch period. She's a little different was a formal alert, and everyone understood what it meant even if nobody could have explained precisely why. The welcome wagon smile never wavered. The evaluation never stopped. You were being welcomed and catalogued simultaneously, and the 2 processes were conducted with such natural warmth that you left the interaction feeling genuinely received, which was also part of the design, because a newcomer who felt warmly welcomed was a newcomer who relaxed, and a newcomer who relaxed told you much more than one who was on guard. The casserole was an investment. It almost always paid off. Nothing in 1960s suburban life communicated status more clearly than the party invitation list, and nothing communicated social death more efficiently than being left off it. The list for a neighbourhood cocktail party, a holiday open house, or even a child's birthday gathering was not assembled casually. It was curated, deliberated over, and in some households discussed at length between husband and wife, the way a general might discuss troop movements. To be included was belonging. To be excluded was a message, quiet, deniable, and perfectly understood by everyone involved. Let's say you're hosting. You sit down at the kitchen table with a notepad and a pen, and you begin to write names. This is not a simple task. The invitation list is a map of your social relationships, yes, but it is also a political document. Every name you include is an endorsement. Every name you leave off is a decision that will be noticed and interpreted by the person left off, by the people included, and by the neighbourhood's broader information network, which will learn the guest list before the party has ended. There is no such thing as a private party in a community this small. The neighbours will know who was there, they will know who was not, and they will understand what both facts mean. The etiquette of exclusion was something women navigated with extraordinary sophistication. You could not leave someone off a list without a reason that would hold up to social scrutiny. A party too small to include everyone was legitimate, but only if the guest count was genuinely small. A party large enough to include everyone on the block except 2 couples was a statement, and everyone would read it correctly. The safer move was the tiered event, the large inclusive gathering at which status differences were temporarily suspended, and the smaller, more selective dinner party where the real social architecture was expressed. The big party was democratic. The dinner party was the truth. Being dropped from the invitation list was its own specific variety of social experience, one that arrived without explanation and had to be processed in silence. You noticed it first as a question. Did something get lost in the mail? And then as a dawning understanding, and then as a conversation you could not have with anyone because having it would confirm that you had noticed, and noticing was its own kind of vulnerability. The suburb's genius, if you want to call it that, was building a system of social consequence that the person experiencing it could not protest without appearing unstable or oversensitive. You were not excluded, you simply were not included. The distinction was everything, and the invitation list, that small piece of paper on a kitchen table, was where the distinction was made, with a pen in someone's careful handwriting, before the party favours had even been bought. Organised religion in post-war suburbia served many functions, and not all of them were spiritual. The church committee, whether it was the Ladies' Auxiliary, the Altar Guild, the Parish Social Committee, or the PTA ministry group, was a legitimised space where neighbourhood women could gather under the umbrella of Christian virtue and exchange information that would have looked, in any other setting, simply like gossip. The sacred surroundings gave the conversation cover. Who was struggling? Whose marriage seemed strained? Who had missed service 3 Sundays running? It was concern. It was community. It was also an intelligence operation. The church was the one institution in the 1960s suburb that could gather women together with a stated purpose that nobody questioned. It had moral authority, it had a meeting schedule, it had refreshments, and it had, critically, a built-in justification for discussing the private lives of other people in the community, because caring for one another was the whole point. If a woman mentioned, at the Ladies' Auxiliary meeting, that she had noticed the Carlson family looking a little thin lately, that was not gossip. That was pastoral concern. If someone else mentioned that she had heard from someone who had heard from someone that there may have been a situation in the household that was not rumour, that was the community looking out for one of its own. The language of Christian charity provided the whole operation with a remarkably durable ethical framework. The committee structure itself was a social hierarchy in formal dress. The woman who chaired the social committee held real organisational power. She scheduled the events, managed the volunteers, and controlled access to the church's most visible social occasions. These positions were not sought openly because openly seeking social power was not done, but they were sought strategically through accumulated service, through the gradual, modest accumulation of visible virtue that made you the obvious choice when the chairmanship came open. The campaign was conducted in acts of selfless contribution. The result was influence. Sunday mornings were particularly rich as information environments. The moment before and after the service, the gathering in the vestibule, the slow movement toward the parking lot, the conversation beside the coffee urn in the fellowship hall, was a condensed version of the coffee clatch, with the added social pressure of public visibility. Everyone was there, everyone was watching, and everyone was, in the way of people who have been trained to be pleasant in public spaces, talking about things that sounded entirely appropriate, while meaning considerably more than they said. A raised eyebrow at the mention of a name was a complete sentence in this language. A "we should pray for them" delivered in a particular tone was a verdict. The church did not create the suburb's gossip network, but it gave it a building, a meeting schedule, and the moral cover it needed to call itself something else entirely. Long before group texts existed, the telephone tree was the suburb's broadcast system, and it operated with an efficiency that would impress a modern communications director. One call became 2, became 8, became the entire block knowing something by dinner time. The telephone tree was officially used for school closures, church announcements, and neighbourhood emergencies. Unofficially, it was used for everything else. The woman at the top of the tree, the one who made the first call, held enormous power. What she said, how she framed it, and who she called first shaped the story before most people had heard the facts. Here is how it worked. You received a call. The caller had something to tell you. Something real, something observed, something heard, and she was calling because she thought you should know, and because she knew you would tell 2 other people, and those people would tell 2 more, and within a few hours the information would have travelled the entire neighbourhood without anyone having to organise anything. The system was elegant in its informality. There was no coordinator, there was no protocol, there was simply a shared understanding that certain kinds of information moved, that it moved through specific people faster than others, and that being one of those people was a position worth having. The telephone itself was significant. In the early 1960s, most households had one telephone, usually in the kitchen or a hallway, on a party line shared with 1 or more neighbours, which meant that your telephone conversations were not private, and everyone knew they were not private, which shaped every call in ways both obvious and subtle. You did not say directly what you meant, you implied, you suggested, you asked. Questions designed to prompt the other person to volunteer the information you were looking for without you having to ask for it outright. "I just wanted to make sure everything was all right over there," was a sentence that could be read 6 different ways, and the person receiving it knew all 6. The first person called in a telephone tree chain was the most important position in the system because the first call set the frame. If you called Margaret first, the story would arrive at the rest of the neighbourhood shaped by Margaret's understanding of it, her sympathies, her existing feelings about the people involved. If you called Barbara first, it would arrive shaped differently. The choice of first call was therefore an editorial decision. You were choosing not just who to inform, but who to empower as the story's first interpreter. This was understood by everyone who participated in the system, and the best operators of the telephone tree were the women who understood it most, clearly. By the time the story reached the last person on the chain, it had been through 8 sets of hands, 8 sets of values, 8 sets of existing opinions. What arrived at the end was the truth, processed. The Parent-Teacher Association of the early 1960s was many things simultaneously. A genuine advocacy group for children's education, a social ladder with clearly marked rungs, and a stage on which neighbourhood women competed for influence with a politeness so sharp it could cut glass. To be elected PTA president was to hold real local power, control over school events, community fundraisers, and the subtle but important question of whose voice got taken seriously when it was time to make decisions. The meetings had Roberts's Rules of Order. They also had scores being settled. You should understand the PTA president's position in the 1960s suburb as something close to a municipal office, except that it required no official election process was held, accountable to no charter, and operated primarily through social consensus and interpersonal pressure. The woman who held the position had access to the school administration, to the community's public calendar, to the volunteer roster, and to the platform of the monthly meeting, a gathering attended by a significant portion of the neighbourhood's women, and thus an audience for any message she needed to send. She did not abuse this position. She managed it. The distinction in this context was meaningful only in theory. The PTA meeting itself was a performance in the theatrical sense, staged, rehearsed in outline if not in script, and conducted in a register of public pleasantness that required participants to say things they meant entirely in the language of things that sounded reasonable. A motion to change the school fundraiser from a bake sale to a catalogue drive was not merely a logistical question. It was a question about whose expertise was valued, whose suggestion had been dismissed the previous year, and who had built enough coalition since then to bring it forward again with sufficient support. The discussion would be polite, the subtext would be dense enough to cut, and the vote at the end would tell you, in numerical form, exactly where the social alliances in the room currently stood. Being deeply involved in the PTA was work, and it was real work, organising events, coordinating volunteers, managing budgets, communicating with school staff. The women who did it well were genuinely capable administrators, operating without salary, without title, and without the professional recognition that the same skill set would have earned in a corporate environment. That the work was unpaid and domestic did not make it less skilled. It made it, in some ways, more demanding, because the incentives were entirely social, and social incentives require a constant, vigilant management of relationship that paid work does not. You could not clock out of the PTA. The PTA was the neighbourhood, and the neighbourhood was always open. In an era before personal privacy truly existed in the suburb, the local beauty parlour was the one space where women's conversations were understood to stay within the walls, and where, precisely because of that understanding, the most candid things were said. Under the dryer, waiting for a set to dry, women spoke with a frankness they rarely permitted themselves in kitchens or church halls. The hairdresser was the keeper of more secrets than any priest, and her shop was the informal archive of every marriage in a 4-block radius. She knew everything. She repeated very little. But what she did repeat had weight. The beauty parlour appointment was a regular scheduled event in a 1960s Woman's Week, and it served purposes well beyond hair maintenance. It was the one appointment she kept for herself, the 1 hour that was structurally hers, conducted in a space managed by a woman, staffed by women, attended by women, with no husbands, no children, and no domestic obligation requiring immediate attention. The combination of that freedom with the physical intimacy of the haircut, someone's hands on your head, your face in a mirror at close range, created conditions of unusual candor. You relaxed in the chair in a way you did not relax anywhere else, and when you relaxed, you talked. The hairdresser occupied a unique social position. She was adjacent to the neighbourhood hierarchy without being inside it. She was a professional providing a service which placed her outside the direct competition of the social network, and that outside position made her safe to talk to. She was not going to use what you told her against you at the next coffee clatch, because she was not at the coffee clatch. She heard things from every woman in the neighbourhood, and therefore had a perspective no individual woman could have. She knew all sides of every story, all versions of every dispute, all the different things different women had said about the same event. This gave her a kind of omniscience that she deployed with careful restraint. Under the dryer was the apex moment of beauty parlour candor. The machine was loud enough to create an acoustic privacy that the open shop floor did not otherwise provide, and the women waiting under adjacent dryers had to lean in to be heard, which created a physical intimacy that lowered inhibitions further. Things were said under the dryer that were not said anywhere else. Marriages were discussed honestly. Fears were named. Regrets surfaced that had nowhere else to go. And the hairdresser, moving through the shop, catching fragments, storing them in the professional discretion she had learned was essential to a business that ran entirely on trust, carried the neighbourhood's interior life in her memory like a private library that nobody else had access to. She was the one person in the community who knew everything, she was also, wisely, the one person who said the least. Once a year, the neighbourhood threw itself a party in the middle of the street, and what looked like a celebration was, from another angle, a census. The block party was the annual recalibration of the social order, a chance to observe who had drifted, who had come up, whose children were becoming problems, whose husband had been drinking more, and who had inexplicably started dressing differently. Potato salad was eaten. Status was assessed. Nobody called it that. But by Sunday evening, when the folding tables were put away and the last paper cup had been collected, the neighbourhood had taken its temperature and arrived at conclusions. The block party had a utopian quality on the surface that was entirely genuine and also entirely useful as cover for everything happening beneath it. The children ran in the street. Somebody's husband grilled things with great confidence and mixed results. Women moved between clusters of conversation with the practiced ease of people who had learned how to work a room while appearing to simply enjoy a party. The utopian surface was real. People were genuinely pleased to see each other, genuinely happy for the children's joy, genuinely grateful for a summer afternoon without ordinary obligation. And underneath the genuine pleasure, the social work was happening, because it always was, because it could not stop, because the network did not have an off switch. Observation at the block party operated on multiple levels simultaneously. You watched who talked to whom and for how long, which told you about the current state of alliances and distances that had shifted since last year's party. You watched the couples, how they stood together, whether they touched, whether she refilled his drink without being asked, which was a sign of a well-managed marriage, or whether there was a particular kind of careful distance between two people who had agreed, without discussion, to perform normalcy for the afternoon. You watched the children, whose behaviour was a direct reflection of the household, and whose interactions with other children told a story about what those households said about each other when children were listening. Children were always listening. The end of the block party was its own social event. People did not leave all at once. They drifted off in waves, and the order of departure was noted. Leaving early suggested something. A couple that needed to get home. A woman who had perhaps seen something she needed to process. A family that was not entirely comfortable. Staying late was its own signal, either of genuine enjoyment or of strategic visibility. The last people standing were the ones who lived the closest, which meant the final conversations of the block party happened among the neighbourhood's most embedded members, and those conversations, quiet in the early evening while children wound down on lawns, were often where the real assessments were finalised. The potato salad bowls were rinsed. The folding chairs were returned. The block's understanding of itself updated. There was no handbook. There was no orientation session. No one gave you a list of rules when you moved into the neighbourhood, and yet somehow, within weeks, you knew them. Because you had been watching, and because small signals had been sent, and because the cost of not knowing them had already been made quietly clear. The unwritten code of 1960s suburban life covered everything from when to put out the trash, to how loudly you were allowed to argue with your husband and still be considered a stable household. It was transmitted through implication, through the slightly too long pause, through the comment that landed just adjacent to a compliment. The unwritten rules governed the visible surfaces of domestic life with remarkable specificity. Your lawn was expected to be mowed on the same approximate schedule as your neighbours' lawns, not because anyone would say anything if you were 2 days behind, but because 2 days behind became 4 days behind, became a lawn that was making a statement. And statements required responses, and responses were unpleasant for everyone. Your children were expected to behave in public in ways that reflected well on the household, which meant that a child's bad day at the school bus stop was a household reputation event and was experienced by the mother as such. Your front door was expected to be painted. Your holiday decorations were expected to appear within the appropriate window, and be removed within the appropriate window after the holiday had passed. Nobody set these windows. Everybody knew them. The system for communicating a violation was itself unwritten, and therefore perfectly deniable. It began with a meaningful look, shared between two women who had both observed the same thing, a silent acknowledgement that something had been noted. It escalated to the gentle, concerned comment, delivered with a warmth that made it impossible to take offence without seeming unstable. I just wanted to mention, because I know you'd want to know. It proceeded, if necessary, to the formal but still friendly conversation, the kind that happened on the driveway and lasted 8 minutes and left the recipient with the clear understanding that something needed to change, without either party having said anything that could be repeated. The whole system was designed to correct without confronting. It worked because everyone had agreed to it, implicitly, by choosing to live here. What the unwritten rules actually were was less important than the fact of their existence and the social cost of violating them. The specific rules varied slightly by neighbourhood, by decade, by social composition. What did not vary was the mechanism, a community that had organised itself around shared standards, enforced through social pressure, with no appeals process and no written record. You learnt the rules by watching what happened to people who didn't know them yet. You internalised them until they felt like your own preferences, and eventually, if you stayed long enough, you became one of the people who transmitted them to newcomers, through implication, through the pause, through the comment that landed just adjacent to a compliment. The code reproduced itself. It didn't need a handbook. It had something more efficient. People. Every block had one. She did not work outside the home. She did not have young children to manage. She had time, a window with a good angle on the street, and an almost academic dedication to the movement patterns of her neighbours. She was not considered dangerous exactly. She was considered observant, which in the social language of the suburb meant that she knew things, and you were wise to be aware of that. She was the suburb's informal surveillance system, never hired, never thanked, and completely indispensable to the information economy of the block. You knew who she was within your first month. She was the woman whose curtain moved slightly when a car pulled up that she did not recognise. She was the one who, when you mentioned offhandedly that you had seen a truck on the street last Tuesday, said yes, that was the miller's nephew. He stayed for 3 hours and left before dinner, with the precision of someone who had been keeping notes. She was not malicious. That is the important thing to understand. She was not sitting at her window with bad intentions. She was sitting at her window because that was her window, and outside her window was the street, and the street was interesting in the way that all human activity is interesting, when you have been given a great deal of time and a limited number of spaces in which to spend it. Her position in the neighbourhood's information network was unique because her data was primary. While most women in the suburb gathered information through conversation, through what people told them, through what they implied, through what they conspicuously did not say, the window woman gathered it through direct observation. She had seen things with her own eyes. In a network that ran largely on second- and third-hand accounts, eyewitness testimony was premium currency. When she told you something, you did not have to wonder whether it had been filtered through someone else's interpretation. You had the raw feed. This made her extraordinarily valuable to anyone who wanted to know what was actually happening on the block, as opposed to the various versions of what was happening that were circulating through the telephone tree. Her relationship with the network was therefore complex. She was essential, but also slightly feared, because the same window that watched your neighbours watched you. You were aware when you pulled into your driveway at an unusual hour that she might be watching. You were aware when you had a visitor who didn't need to be explained that the explanation might be required anyway. Her presence kept the block's behaviour calibrated in a way that no explicit rule could have managed. You did not do certain things simply because you knew she was there. This was not oppression. It was community, in one of its less comfortable forms. She rarely initiated the information she held. She waited to be asked, which was its own form of power. Coming to her meant acknowledging that she had something you needed, and she received these approaches with a gracious modesty that fooled nobody. Of course she had noticed. She always noticed. She noticed the day the Hendersons' son came home from college looking different. She noticed the week the Carlsons stopped speaking to each other on the driveway. She noticed things that other people had not thought to look for until they suddenly needed to know. She was the block's institutional memory, housed in a woman in a housecoat by a window, with a cup of coffee going cold on the sill beside her. Unelected, uncompensated, and absolutely essential. The network could function without many things. It could not function without her. When something went wrong in a neighbour's household, an illness, a death, a husband's unexplained absence, a car that hadn't moved in 4 days, the suburb's response was swift, organised, and food-based. Women arrived at the door with covered dishes and a warmth that was entirely genuine and also entirely curious. The casserole delivery was both an act of real kindness and a reconnaissance mission. You knocked, you handed over the dish, you were invited in, and in the 12 minutes you spent in that kitchen, you gathered more information about the state of that household than a journalist could have collected in a week. Let's be honest about the casserole, because the casserole deserves honesty. It was real. The food was real. The labour of making it was real. And the impulse that sent a woman across the street with a warm dish in her hands was genuine human kindness. The same impulse that has moved communities to feed their struggling members for as long as communities have existed. When your neighbour was sick, you brought food. When there was a death, you brought food. When something was clearly wrong and nobody was sure exactly what, you brought food. Because food was something you could do, and doing something was better than doing nothing, and the food was also genuinely needed. Do not let anything else in this segment diminish that. The casserole was an act of care. The casserole was also a key. It gained you entry to a household that was, in a moment of stress or grief or domestic difficulty, operating below its usual standard of presentation. Under normal circumstances, a neighbour's home was prepared for visitors before visitors arrived, the visible surfaces managed, the emotional atmosphere regulated, the story of the household curated to present its best version. But a household receiving casseroles was a household that had not had time to prepare, and that unpreparedness was information. The dishes in the sink, the children's shoes in the hallway, the husband's absence or unusual presence, the way she looked when she opened the door before she had a moment to arrange her expression into something more composed. These details were noted with sympathy and filed with precision. The conversation inside the door was its own skilled performance. You did not ask direct questions, because direct questions were rude. And you were not rude, you were caring. Instead, you offered openings. You must be exhausted. It must be so hard with the children that invited the other woman to fill in whatever she was willing to share. And people in distress shared more than they intended to, because distress loosens the careful management of information that ordinary social life requires. You left knowing considerably more than you had arrived with, and the knowledge you left with would be shared at the next coffee clatch in the spirit of the neighbourhood, keeping an eye on someone who needed it. The concern was genuine. The debrief was also genuine. Both happened. This is what made the Casserole network one of the most sophisticated information-gathering operations in domestic American history, dressed in Corningware. The receipt of the casserole had its own etiquette demands. You thanked the woman warmly. You invited her in, briefly, because to not invite her in would seem cold, and you could not afford to seem cold in a moment when the neighbourhood was already watching your household with heightened attention. You returned the dish promptly, clean, because the speed and condition of the dish's return was itself a signal. A clean dish back within 2 days said we're recovering. We are managing. We are going to be fine. A dish that came back 3 weeks later, still with food in it, said something else entirely. Even the Corningware was sending messages. Everything in the suburb was sending messages. That was simply how the suburb communicated. In 1960s suburbia, a woman's social position was in significant part a function of her husband's occupation, his income, and the company he worked for. This was not cynical, it was structural. The suburb had been built around a specific economic arrangement in which the man commuted and the woman managed the domestic sphere, and that arrangement created a clear hierarchy that women navigated with tremendous sophistication. A husband who worked in management was not the same as a husband who worked on the floor. A husband who was being considered for promotion had a wife who was watched differently. The office was downtown. The politics happened at home. Think about what it meant to be a woman in the 1960s suburb, and to have your social identity anchored to someone else's professional trajectory. You had not chosen his job. You had not sat in the interview. You could not control whether his boss liked him, or whether the division was having a good quarter. And yet his professional standing was your social standing, reflected back at you every day in the quality of the invitations you received, the warmth of the greetings at the school pickup, the way other women introduced you at parties. She's Tom Henderson's wife. Tom's at Procter & Gamble. He's in marketing. That sentence contained your entire social biography. Tom's occupation was the headline. You were the context. The hierarchy was specific, and everyone understood it without being taught. A doctor's wife occupied the highest available rung, followed closely by a lawyer's wife, then a corporate executive's wife, and then a series of gradations downward through middle management, sales, skilled trades, and eventually positions that were not discussed directly, but whose social implications were clearly understood. The hierarchy was not about income alone. A successful salesman might earn more than a junior doctor. It was about the cultural prestige of the occupation, its stability, its perceived trajectory. Management meant upward mobility, which meant your social position was not fixed, which meant you were worth investing in. The floor meant the opposite, and was treated as such. What this created in practice was a social environment in which women were intensely invested in their husbands' professional lives, not because they were professionally interested, but because the professional was personal. A promotion was a social event. A demotion, or a job loss, or a lateral transfer that looked like a sidestep was a social crisis. Women discussed these events at coffee clatches with the informed analytical attention of people whose livelihoods depended on the analysis, because in the most direct sense possible, their livelihoods did. You tracked the corporate fortunes of every husband on the block, because those fortunes told you where the social power was moving, who was rising, and who was beginning the long, quiet slide toward the edge of the invitation list. The office was downtown, behind closed doors in meetings women never attended, but its outcomes arrived in the suburb every evening at 5:30, wearing a suit and carrying a briefcase, and the suburb read those outcomes with an accuracy that would have surprised anyone who assumed the women were not paying attention. They were always paying attention. They had nothing else to do but pay attention, which made them very, very good at it. The children of the suburb did not know it, but their friendships, birthday party invitations, and after-school arrangements were often extensions of their parents' social relationships, and occasionally their social conflicts. A child refused a playdate, a birthday party guest list curated to exclude, a team assignment that someone's mother had a quiet word about with the coach. The children played, the mothers managed the field, and through the remarkably efficient medium of children telling their parents what they'd heard at school, the information loop was closed every single afternoon at the kitchen table. Children, in the 1960s suburb, were social assets. This sounds harsh, and was probably not experienced consciously by anyone involved, but it was structurally true. A well-behaved, well-dressed, pleasantly sociable child reflected well on the household and created opportunities for the mother, invitations extended, relationships built, entry points into social circles that might otherwise have remained closed. A child who was difficult, or who had developed a reputation for something, or who was simply not popular, was a liability that required management. You could not entirely control who your child liked, but you could shape the field, and shaping the field was something suburban. Mothers of the early 1960s did with the same careful attention they brought to everything else. The playdate was the atomic unit of children's social management. It was arranged between mothers, not between children, which meant that a request for a playdate was also a social approach, an implicit offer of friendship between households. To accept was to open a connection. To decline required a reason that was both plausible and gentle, because declining a child's playdate was refusing a woman's social approach, and that refusal would be felt and understood as such, even if the language remained entirely child-focused. Susie Has Piano that afternoon was a diplomatic response. 3 consecutive afternoons of piano sent a message that did not require interpretation. Birthday parties were the annual high-stakes expression of children's social politics. The guest list for a child's birthday party was negotiated between the child's actual desires, which were straightforward and based on genuine affection, and the mother's social calculations, which were not. Including a child whose mother was in good standing strengthened the household social position. Excluding a child whose mother had recently become problematic sent a signal that could be delivered with complete deniability. After all, children have their own friendships, and you could not invite everyone. The child delivering the invitations did not know what the invitation list meant. The mothers exchanging glances at the school gate the next morning knew exactly what it meant. And then there was the afternoon debrief. Every afternoon, a child came home from school and, while eating whatever was put in front of them, reported on the day. They did not know they were reporting. They thought they were just talking. But the information a child brought home from school, who had said what, which teacher had said what, who was in trouble, whose parents had come in for a meeting, what was being whispered about on the playground, fed directly into the neighbourhood's information network through the most reliable pipeline available. The absolute uncensored candour of a 7-year-old who had not yet learned that some things were better left unreported. The mothers listened, the mothers processed, the mothers filed it, the children went out to play, the network updated itself, one after-school snack at a time. Moving into a new suburban neighbourhood in the early 1960s did not mean immediate acceptance. It meant a probationary period of indeterminate length during which you were watched, discussed, evaluated, and provisionally welcomed while the neighbourhood made up its collective mind about you. The probation was never announced. Its end was never formalised either. You simply noticed at some point that you were being included differently, that the phone calls were warmer, that someone had told you something she would not have told you 6 months ago. You had passed. What the test had been exactly was never explained. The probationary period lasted, on average, somewhere between 6 months and a year, though the timeline varied depending on how quickly the newcomer demonstrated her understanding of the neighbourhood's unwritten rules and how closely she aligned with its existing social composition. A woman who arrived already knowing how to behave, who placed her trash can correctly, whose children were visibly managed, who attended the right events in the right spirit and contributed without overreaching, could compress the timeline considerably. A woman who made early errors, even small ones, extended it. The probation was not punitive, it was protective. The neighbourhood was a system that had taken years to calibrate, and a new variable required careful evaluation before it was trusted with the system's more sensitive operations. During the probationary period, you received invitations, but not to everything. You were included in the larger, more public social gatherings, the block party, the church social, the neighbourhood holiday open house, but not yet in the smaller, more selective events where real relationships were conducted and real information was exchanged. This was not exclusion. It was staging. The large events allowed the neighbourhood to observe you in a social setting without giving you access to information you had not yet earned. You were in the room, but you were not in the conversation. You were being watched, and part of what was being assessed was whether you noticed you were being watched, and whether you handled that awareness gracefully. The women who accelerated through the probationary period most quickly shared a specific set of qualities. They contributed without being asked. They showed up at the school fundraiser, they volunteered for the committee, they brought food when food was needed, which demonstrated investment in the community's social life. They listened more than they talked in the early months, which was both appropriate and strategically wise, because talking required knowledge you did not yet have, and talking without knowledge produced errors. They asked questions rather than offering opinions, which signalled humility and created opportunities for the women who answered to feel valued as sources of local expertise. They were warm without being intense, present without being intrusive. They made the neighbourhood feel good about itself, and the neighbourhood, feeling good about itself, extended trust. Eventually, someone told you something real. That was how you knew you were in. A rumour in the 1960s suburb was not a static object. It was a living thing that moved through the network, changed shape with each retelling, picked up detail, shed accuracy, and arrived at its final destination only loosely related to whatever had actually happened. The life cycle followed a recognisable pattern. An observation, a speculation, a softening hedge, I'm not saying, I'm just saying, and then, after enough repetitions, a certainty. By the time a story had travelled 3 houses in 2 directions, the original facts were ghosts inside it. What mattered was the version that had stuck. The birth of a rumour was almost always modest. Someone saw something. A car parked somewhere it was unexpected. A woman who seemed upset at the grocery store. A husband home in the middle of a workday. The observation itself was usually neutral. There were any number of explanations, most of them perfectly ordinary. But the observation, shared with one other person, immediately became a question, and the question immediately attracted hypothesis. An hypothesis in a community with strong existing opinions about the people involved almost always moved in the direction of the most interesting available interpretation. The most interesting available interpretation was rarely the most accurate one, but it was the one that travelled. The first mutation happened at the point of first sharing. The woman telling the story added context, the things she already knew or suspected about the household in question, the relevant history, the previous incidents that now seemed, in light of this, new information to form a pattern. This context was added in good faith mostly. She genuinely believed it was relevant, and some of it was. But context shaped the story, and once shaped, the story was harder to reshape. The second person who heard it heard not the original observation, but the observation plus the context, and when she passed it on, she added her own context on top of that. And by the third retelling, the story had a structure, a beginning, a middle, and an implied conclusion that the original observation had never contained. The half-life of a neighbourhood scandal depended almost entirely on what category it fell into. Minor social infractions, a party that went too loud, a comment made at the wrong moment, decayed relatively quickly, metabolized by the network within a few weeks, and replaced by newer material. But certain categories of story had extraordinary staying power. Anything involving a marriage was durable. Anything involving money problems or professional failure persisted. Anything involving the children was nearly permanent. These stories did not disappear when they stopped being actively discussed. They went into storage, held in the long memory of the network, available to be retrieved whenever a new piece of information made them relevant again. The suburb did not forget these things, it simply filed them. And occasionally, years later, when something new happened that connected to an old story, the file was pulled out, dusted off, and the story resumed exactly where it had been paused, updated, but fundamentally unchanged. The rumour was patient. It had nowhere else to be. The suburb had refined, over decades, a system of social punishment so clean it was almost elegant. Nobody fought. Nobody confronted. Nobody left a note. The freeze-out, the gradual withdrawal of invitations, phone calls, warm greetings and social inclusion was performed with such calibrated ambiguity that the woman receiving it could not be entirely certain. It was happening, and certainly could not prove it. She would notice that she'd not been included in the last two get-togethers. She would notice that conversations seemed to end slightly earlier when she arrived. She would begin to question herself before she questioned anything else. That was the point. The freeze-out was never total, because total exclusion would have been obvious and therefore actionable. A woman who was openly excluded had something to point at, a grievance that had a shape. The genius of the suburban freeze-out was that it operated at the level of warmth reduction rather than contact elimination. You were still invited to the block party, because not inviting you would have been a statement. You were still greeted on the driveway, because not greeting you would have been rude. The invitations and greetings continued. What changed was their temperature. The phone calls became slightly less frequent. The coffee clatch gatherings you were included in became slightly less the ones where anything important was discussed. The conversations at the school pickup that used to continue for 10 minutes began to conclude after 4. Nothing had happened. Everything had changed. What made the freeze-out particularly effective as a social instrument was that it weaponized the target's own self-doubt. A woman who noticed these changes had 2 available interpretations. The first was that the neighbourhood had turned against her, for some reason she might or might not be able to identify. The second was that she was imagining it, that she was being oversensitive, reading too much into ordinary variations in social attention, creating a problem that did not exist. The suburb's culture of pleasantness, its deep investment in the appearance of harmony, made the second interpretation feel more socially responsible than the first. To name the freeze-out was to appear paranoid. To accuse people of withdrawing warmth was to demonstrate that you did not understand how these things worked. The safest response was to behave as though nothing was wrong. And behaving as though nothing was wrong, while something was clearly wrong, produced exactly the kind of anxious, slightly diminished social presentation that confirmed the neighbourhood's existing concerns about you and deepened the freeze. The way out of a freeze-out was rarely through confrontation, which was not available as a tool in this environment anyway. It was through correction, through identifying, usually through painful self-examination and careful social reading, what you had done or been or represented that had triggered the withdrawal, and then quietly adjusting yourself until the temperature began to rise again. Women who managed this successfully rarely spoke of it afterward, because speaking of it meant acknowledging it had happened, and acknowledging it had happened meant acknowledging that you had been found wanting and had changed yourself in response. That acknowledgement sat in the throat and stayed there. The freeze-out left no evidence, neither did its resolution. The warmth simply returned, and everyone pretended it had never been otherwise. To be a good wife in the 1960s suburb was to meet a standard that was at once highly specific and conveniently shifting. It included the visible cleanliness of your home, the behaviour of your children in public, the appearance you presented at neighbourhood events, and the manner in which you discussed, or declined to discuss, your husband's faults. It also included things like emotional availability, decorative holiday effort, and whether you had seemed too tired at the last cocktail party. The standard was not written down because writing it down would have revealed how subjective it was. Instead, it was upheld through the quiet consensus of women who had all been evaluated by it themselves. The physical dimension of the good wife standard was the most legible because it was visible. Your home was the primary text. Visitors to your home and the suburb generated a constant stream of visitors, both invited and functionally unavoidable, read it with the fluency of people who had been trained to read domestic environments since childhood. A clean kitchen meant a managed household. A visibly clean kitchen with organised counters and a spotless stovetop meant a managed household run with standards. A kitchen with last night's dishes still in the rack at 2 p.m. was a household that was struggling, or a woman who had other priorities, and neither of those readings was comfortable in the context of the 1960s suburb's expectations. You were not keeping house for yourself. You were keeping house as a performance of domestic competence, and the audience was always available. The social dimension was more demanding because it was less controllable. The good wife standard required you to appear at all neighbourhood events as the pleasant, composed, supportive companion of your husband, attentive to him in public in ways that signalled a healthy marriage, but not so attentive that you seemed anxious about it, because anxiety suggested a marriage that needed monitoring. You were to be warm to other women without forming the kinds of intense, individual friendships that might be interpreted as compensation for a difficult home life. You were to discuss your husband favourably in his absence, and in ways that were specific enough to seem genuine, but not so specific that you appeared to be performing. You were to be happy without seeming to be performing happiness, which was the most demanding theatrical note imaginable, and the one the suburb asked for every single day. The standard moved because the evaluators moved. What satisfied one cluster of women in the neighbourhood did not necessarily satisfy another. What had satisfied last year's PTA crowd might not satisfy the new social configuration that had emerged since the Petersons moved in and shifted the dynamics on the north end of the block. There was no appeal to a consistent standard because the standard was never consistent. It was a rolling social consensus, adjusted in real time by the shifting composition and mood of the women enforcing it. This was not, for most of them, a conscious cruelty. It was the natural operation of a community maintaining its norms. But for the woman being evaluated, the shifting standard meant that stability was never fully achievable, compliance was never fully verifiable, and the work of being a good wife in the eyes of the neighbourhood was never, in any meaningful sense, done. There was a specific taxonomy of neighbourhood knowledge that everyone possessed and nobody acknowledged directly, and near the top of it was the category of the husband who worked late. In a community where men's schedules were known, where cars were tracked by their presence or absence, and where a wife's demeanour at the morning coffee was a legible text, the neighbourhood usually knew before the wife admitted it, or sometimes before she knew herself. The careful courtesy extended to a woman in that situation, the extra warmth, the slightly more attentive coffee invitation, was the suburb at its most humanely conspiratorial. The husband's car was a primary data source in the suburb's information network, and nobody who lived there would have denied this if asked directly, which nobody ever was. You knew when every husband on your block was usually home. You knew the sound of certain engines. You knew which driveway lights came on at which hour, and the nights those lights did not come on at the expected time were noted with the same involuntary attention you gave a clock that had stopped. The car's absence past a certain hour was not by itself meaningful. Men worked late. That was true and ordinary. But a pattern of absence, combined with other signals, combined with the particular way his wife answered when you asked casually how things were going, assembled itself into a picture that the neighbourhood read before anyone had said a word. The courtesy extended to a woman in this situation was exquisite in its precision. It was calibrated to communicate awareness without forcing acknowledgement. to offer support without demanding the admission that support was needed. An extra phone call on a Tuesday, a warmth at coffee that was slightly softer than usual, an offer to take the children for an afternoon that was framed as a convenience rather than a kindness. Nobody said we know. Nobody asked directly. To ask directly would have been to puncture the story the woman was maintaining, that everything was fine, that her husband worked hard, that the car's late arrivals were simply the reasonable demands of a professional life, and puncturing that story served nobody. The story was a protection. The neighbourhood understood this and kept it intact. What the suburb did in these situations was create a zone of collective pretense that was also a form of collective protection. The woman in difficulty was allowed to maintain her version of events for as long as she needed to, and the neighbourhood sustained that version publicly, while privately acknowledging the reality among themselves. This was not hypocrisy, or not only hypocrisy. It was a community managing a painful situation with the tools available to it, which were limited to social courtesy, indirect support, and the maintenance of a public fiction that preserved the dignity of someone who needed her dignity preserved. The suburb was not always kind, but in these moments it understood something true, that some things were too real to be said out loud in a community that depended on the appearance of everything being fine. The appearance was held together carefully by women who knew better, saying nothing, refilling the coffee cup, and staying a little longer than they had planned. When the men went to the backyard to discuss whatever men discussed at backyard gatherings, the women were left together in the kitchen, and those were the real conversations. The ones that happened in the kitchen, near the food, refilling glasses that didn't need refilling, were often the most honest exchanges of the entire event. Marriages were evaluated. Fears were expressed in language slightly below directness, in the register of implication and knowing pause. Someone might say, "I don't know how she does it," and everyone in the room would understand exactly what was being said, and about whom, and what it meant. The kitchen at a dinner party was a decompression chamber. The social performance required by mixed company, the performance of the happy couple, the performance of the contented wife, the performance of a life that was exactly what it appeared to be, could be partially suspended in the kitchen, among women, while the men were outside doing whatever it was men did outside at these things. There was a loosening that happened, not a collapse. The suburb's women were too well trained for anything as undisciplined as a collapse, but a relaxation of the outermost layer of the performance, just enough to let something real come through in the spaces between the sentences. The language of these kitchen conversations was its own dialect, and fluency in it was acquired over years of participation. Direct statements were rare. What substituted for them was a sophisticated system of implication, question, and response, in which the actual content of what was being communicated was always one layer below the surface of what was being said. "He's been under a lot of pressure at work" meant something specific. "She seems tired lately" meant something specific. "They seem very happy," delivered with a slight upward inflection at the end of the sentence, meant something almost precisely opposite to its literal content. The women in the kitchen understood these encodings perfectly. They had been speaking this language since they arrived in the suburb, and many of them had been speaking it their whole lives. What was actually said in these kitchens, decoded, was often startling in its honesty. Marriages that appeared seamless from the outside were quietly acknowledged as difficult. Ambitions that had been set aside were occasionally named, briefly, before being just as quickly repackaged as contentment. Women who had wanted something other than this, a career, a different city, a different life entirely, sometimes let that wanting surface for a moment in the kitchen, in the company of other women who recognised it because they felt it too, before tucking it back in and returning to the living room with a refilled tray of something. The moment passed. It always passed. But it had happened, and the woman who had let something real show knew that the women around her had seen it, and would not mention it, and would be, in some quiet way, more tender toward her because of it. This was the kitchen's gift, not solutions, not revolt, but recognition. The suburb did not give women many spaces in which to be recognised as something beyond their domestic role. The kitchen conversation at a dinner party, brief and encoded and deniable, was one of them. The men came back inside. The tray was brought out. The performance resumed. But something had been exchanged in the kitchen, something small and real and shared, and the women carried it home with them at the end of the evening like a coin held in a closed hand. It was not much. In the context of the lives they were living, it was also not nothing. Every weekday afternoon, the school pickup line assembled with the reliability of a newsroom going to press, and it functioned in much the same way. Women gathered in cars or on the sidewalk, a window of 15 to 20 minutes opened, and information moved. What had been learned since morning coffee? Whose child had come home upset the day before? Had anyone seen the moving truck on Elm? The school. Pickup was not incidental to the neighbourhood's information infrastructure. It was a scheduled daily exchange, the closing bell of the social market, and everyone who participated understood its value. The geometry of the pickup line determined its social dynamics in ways that were never discussed and immediately understood. Women who arrived early and on foot had the most time and the most flexibility. They could move between clusters of conversation, contribute to multiple exchanges, and position themselves near the people they most needed to speak with that afternoon. Women who arrived in cars were more fixed, their conversations determined by who happened to pull up beside them, which introduced an element of chance that the more socially deliberate among the group found mildly frustrating. The ideal pickup line position was on foot, early, near the main gate, with a clear sight line in both directions. The women who consistently occupied this position were not there by accident. The 15 to 20 minutes of the pickup window had an internal rhythm that regulars knew precisely. The first 5 minutes were for general circulation, the wide, warm, inclusive exchange of pleasantries that established the social atmosphere for the whole interaction and allowed everyone to take a quick read of the room. Who was tense today? Who had something? Who was avoiding whom? The middle portion was where the real exchanges happened. The specific, purposeful conversations conducted at lower volume between women who had something to share or receive. The final minutes before the children emerged were for the conclusions, the wrapping up, the agreements, the quick planning of tomorrow's coffee, and for the rapid social calculations that determined who you wanted to be standing next to when the doors opened. Because the walk to the car, child in hand, was also a conversation, and the conversation you had on that walk was observed by everyone remaining. The information velocity of the pickup line was higher than almost any other node in the network because it was daily. The coffee clatch met several times a week, but not every day. The telephone tree was event-driven. The pickup line happened every single school day, rain or shine, and its consistency meant that the network was refreshed and updated every afternoon, with a regularity that kept the information circulating at speed. A story that entered the network at morning coffee could be confirmed, expanded, contradicted, or retired by afternoon pickup, having travelled through the telephone tree in between. By the time the children were buckled into the back seat and the cars were pulling away from the curb, the neighbourhood's collective understanding of itself had been updated for the day. Tomorrow morning it would begin again. The newsroom never closed. It just sent everyone home for dinner and reconvened at 8:45. Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique in 1963, and in it she described what she called the problem that has no name, the quiet suffocation of educated, capable women pressed into a domestic role that filled no part of them that needed filling. In the suburb, this problem wore a social costume. It was called being nervous, or being tired, or having a lot on her plate. The woman who cried and could not explain why was said to be having a hard time. The woman who drank more than she used to was managing. The neighbourhood noted it. The neighbourhood covered for it. The neighbourhood almost never asked directly what was wrong, because asking directly was not how the network worked. The symptoms were visible if you knew how to read them, and the women of the suburb knew how to read them because most of them were managing versions of the same thing at various intensities. A woman who had been consistently bright and energetic at social gatherings, and who began arriving looking as though she had assembled her appearance from a great distance. A woman who laughed at the right moments, but whose laughter had lost its spontaneity and become a social reflex, deployed on cue rather than triggered by genuine amusement. A woman who had always been a reliable presence at the coffee clatch and who began cancelling once, then twice, then more regularly, with reasons that were plausible individually and collectively constituted a pattern. The network saw these things. The network absorbed them into its understanding of that household. The network covered. The covering was genuine and it was also self-interested, and these two things were not in conflict. The suburb covered for its struggling women because it was a community, and communities supported their members. It also covered because the alternative, acknowledging openly that a woman was not coping, that the life the suburb was collectively endorsing was producing in some of its participants something that looked uncomfortably like despair, was a conversation the suburb was not equipped to have. To name the problem would have required examining the system that was producing it, and examining the system was threatening to everyone inside the system, including the women doing the covering, who were managing their own versions of the unnamed thing and had made their own accommodations with it. The medical response available to these women was not much better than the social one. A woman who presented to her doctor with sadness, fatigue, tearfulness without apparent cause, and a pervasive sense of emptiness was likely to receive a prescription for tranquilizers and a recommendation to rest and not take on too much. Valium, introduced in 1963 and almost immediately prescribed in enormous quantities to American women, was called Mother's Little Helper and was dispensed with the same casual frequency as aspirin. It did not fix the unnamed problem. It made the unnamed problem quieter, which in the context of the suburb's social requirements was functionally the same thing. You could perform Containment on Valium, you could attend the coffee clatch, refill the percolator, laugh at the right moments. The performance continued. The problem went unnamed, and the neighbourhood, watching carefully and saying nothing, quietly noted who was managing and who was not, and adjusted its casserole schedule accordingly. The placement of a household's trash can told a story. The condition of the yard in front of the house told a story. The lights left on or off at unusual hours told a story. In a community without fences, without real privacy, and with a shared investment in neighbourhood appearance, the material surface of domestic life was readable text, and women who had lived on the block for years were fluent in it. You could tell, from a walk to the mailbox, more than most people would have felt comfortable admitting. The suburb rewarded this kind of reading. It called it being observant. It called it community spirit. The trash can was the suburb's most democratic data source because everyone had one, and everyone's was visible on collection day, sitting at the curb with whatever it contained. Experienced readers of suburban trash, and the experience was acquired without any conscious intention to acquire it, simply through years of walking past curbs on Tuesday mornings, could extract a surprising amount of information from a household's discarded materials. Volume told you about consumption levels. Specific items glimpsed through the open top of an unfilled can told you about purchases. The presence or absence of bottles told you about the household's relationship with alcohol, in a community where that relationship carried significant social meaning. None of this required rooting through the garbage. It required only the ordinary visual attention of someone walking past. The information presented itself. The yard was a more complex text because it operated over time and required a baseline for comparison. A yard that had always been well maintained and began showing signs of neglect was a different signal from a yard that had always been slightly casual. The first suggested a change in the household's capacity. The second simply described its style. Seasonal decoration was its own register of neighbourhood communication. A household that put up Christmas lights on the same weekend as everyone else was participating in the community's shared rhythms. A household that put them up late, or not at all, or took them down in March, was varying from the norm in ways that invited interpretation. The interpretation was always offered. Whether it was accurate was a separate question. What this system of environmental reading produced was a continuous low-resolution awareness of every household on the block that required no conversation and left no record. You did not decide to monitor your neighbours. You simply lived alongside them at close range for years, and monitoring happened as a byproduct of proximity and attention. The women who were most skilled at reading these environmental signals were also, not coincidentally, the women most central to the neighbourhood's information network, because they arrived at every coffee clatch already holding context that others did not have, having processed the street's material surface on their morning walk to the mailbox with the quiet thoroughness of someone who had been doing it so long it no longer felt like anything except walking to the mailbox. The trash can was not surveillance. It was Tuesday morning. The information was simply there, available to anyone paying attention. In the 1960s suburb, everyone was paying attention. Paying attention was the primary occupation of a great many very intelligent women who had been given very little else to do with their considerable capacity for observation. When a woman left the suburb through divorce, through her husband's job transfer, through a breakdown, or simply through deciding she could not do this anymore, the neighbourhood's processing of her departure said everything about the social system she had been inside. If she left quietly and under acceptable circumstances, she was missed warmly and discussed briefly. If she left badly, if she left because of something the neighbourhood had been tracking, or something it had contributed to, the story was revised, the narrative tidied, and within a season she had become a cautionary reference, a name used to illustrate a point, a woman who had not been able to manage. The job transfer departure was the suburb's cleanest exit narrative, because it required no interpretation. The husband's company was moving him to Cincinnati or Cleveland or somewhere with a similar number of syllables, and the family was following as families did, as the economic arrangement of the suburb required them to do. This departure was mourned genuinely and processed quickly. A farewell gathering was organised. A card was signed by everyone on the block. Addresses were exchanged with the sincere intention of corresponding that was almost never fulfilled. The woman was absorbed into the neighbourhood's memory as someone who had been here, had been good at being here, and had left for reasons entirely outside anyone's control. She was referenced occasionally in the years after. The Hendersons used to live there. Lovely family. And then, as the details faded, less often, until she existed only as a quality of the house she had occupied, which new residents would gradually overwrite with their own presence. The divorce departure was entirely different, and the neighbourhood's handling of it revealed the limits of the community's generosity with considerable clarity. Divorce in the early 1960s was still sufficiently uncommon in the suburb to constitute an event, not a scandal exactly, not anymore, but a significant disruption that required social processing. The story was assembled quickly from the materials available, what the network had observed about the marriage over the preceding months or years, what had been said at coffee clatches and implied at pickup lines, what the window woman had noted and what the telephone tree had carried. By the time the moving truck appeared, the neighbourhood had already constructed its account of what had happened and why, and that account had the clean, resolved shape of a narrative that had been told enough times to have settled into its final form. The woman who left in this way was absorbed into the community's oral history as a lesson, though the lesson was rarely stated explicitly because explicit statements were not how the suburb operated. She was referenced carefully in contexts where her story was relevant to a present concern, a marriage that seemed to be developing similar patterns, a woman who seemed to be making similar choices. "You remember what happened with Carol" was a complete sentence in this community, understood by everyone who had been there and filed away by anyone who had not. She had become a reference point. She had left the suburb had kept the story, and the story, processed and tidied and stripped of complexity, served the network's ongoing need for cautionary material with a durability that the woman herself, wherever she'd gone, would probably not have appreciated. The 1960s suburban gossip network had a long memory and a selective one. Minor infractions, a bad party, a strange outfit, an embarrassing comment at a school event were generally metabolized within months. But certain categories of information were stored indefinitely, anything involving marriage, money, or the children. These were held in the communal memory like a card in a filing cabinet, not consulted often, but retrievable when needed. If you had been discussed in any of those categories, the information did not expire. It simply went quiet, waiting. The mechanism of communal memory in the suburb was not a single person's recollection, but a distributed archive held across multiple women, each of whom carried fragments of the whole. No one person remembered everything about every household on the block, but the network as a collective remembered almost everything, because different pieces of the record were held by different keepers. The woman who had been closest to the situation at the time held the most detail. The woman who had processed it most analytically held the interpretation. The woman who had heard the most versions held the range of available readings. Together they constituted a record more complete than any individual could have maintained, retrievable through conversation whenever a new piece of information made retrieval relevant. What determined whether a story was stored or metabolized was not the severity of the event but its category. The suburb had an implicit taxonomy of significance that governed how long different kinds of information were retained. Social missteps, arriving at a party underdressed, making an unfortunate comment, hosting an event that fell flat, were categorized as human error and given a generous statute of limitations. These things happened to everyone, and the community's investment in its own social comfort meant that dwelling on them served nobody's interests. They were discussed, gently filed, and allowed to fade. Structural failures were different. A marriage in difficulty was a structural failure. It suggested that the fundamental unit of the suburb's social organization was not functioning as designed, and structural failures were retained because they informed the community's ongoing assessment of a household's stability and reliability. The information was stored not for punishment but for context. It shaped how the network read everything that household did afterward. The long memory expressed itself most clearly in moments of new crisis. When something new happened in a household that had a history, the network's response was shaped by that history in ways that were never explicitly acknowledged but were unmistakably present. A second incident read differently than a first. A pattern confirmed a suspicion that had been held in quiet storage for years. The women who'd been tracking a situation from the beginning arrived at the new development with a fully formed context that newcomers to the block could not access. They had the file, accumulated over time, and the file gave them a reading of the present that was richer and more certain than anything a recent arrival could produce. The long memory was not held against people. It was simply available quietly, whenever the present required the past to make sense of it. Every neighborhood had at least one couple who had arrived with the right credentials and somehow still managed to be wrong for the block, too loud, too private, too focused on the wrong things, or simply constituted in a way that the neighborhood found difficult to read. The response to such a couple was not exclusion exactly. That would have been unkind, and the suburb took pride in its kindness. It was something more like gentle, sustained pressure. Invitations extended that gently communicated the behavioural expectations attached to them. Social warmth calibrated to reinforce correct behaviour. It was a training program with canapes. The couple that didn't fit was usually not wrong in any way that could be named directly, because if it could have been named directly, someone would have named it, and the situation would have resolved into something manageable. The problem was more atmospheric than specific. They were somehow off. The husband talked too much at the block party, or not enough, or about the wrong things, his opinions too strong, or his interest too narrow, or his manner of engaging with other men slightly out of register with the block's existing social tone. The wife was too independent, perhaps, or too credentialed, or too openly opinionated about things that women on this particular block had agreed, without discussing it, to treat as settled. There was something that did not align. The neighbourhood felt it before it could articulate it, which is always the more dangerous kind of feeling. The integration campaign was never called that. It was called being welcoming. It was called making them feel at home. It manifested as a series of social invitations calibrated not just to include the couple, but to acculturate them, to put them in situations where the neighbourhood's norms were visibly and pleasantly on display, and where conforming to those norms was the natural, comfortable, socially rewarded path. The dinner party where the conversation covered certain topics and not others. The committee invitation that brought the wife into a social structure with its own existing culture and expectations. The backyard gathering where the unspoken rules of the block's social life were performed so consistently and warmly that absorbing them felt less like compliance and more like belonging. The success rate of these campaigns was moderate. Couples who were off in minor ways, whose misalignment was superficial or behavioural rather than fundamental, generally found their way toward the neighbourhood's centre of gravity within a year or two, their sharper edges softened by social pressure and their own desire to belong to something. Couples whose misalignment ran deeper, who held genuinely different values, or who were different in ways the neighbourhood could not or would not accommodate, tended to remain on the social periphery indefinitely, included in the large public gatherings and excluded from the smaller, more intimate ones, maintained at the precise social distance that allowed the neighbourhood to consider itself welcoming, while ensuring that its inner circle remained unchanged. The campaign continued, technically, for as long as they lived on the block. It simply shifted, after a certain point, from active integration to passive containment. The canapes were still served, the warmth was still extended. Nobody acknowledged that anything had failed. It was the suburb, nothing ever officially failed. The suburb ran on a status hierarchy that was never formally acknowledged and meticulously observed. At the top were the wives of professionals, doctors, lawyers, executives, who were given a measure of latitude unavailable to women further down the hierarchy. They could host more extravagantly, opine more freely, and absorb more unusual behaviour before the network moved against them. Below them, gradations of occupational prestige ordered the remaining households with a precision that would have impressed a medieval court. Nobody discussed the hierarchy directly. Nobody needed to. Its operation was smooth enough that it appeared, from inside, to be simply the way things were. The doctor's wife occupied the apex of the suburban status hierarchy with a security that came not from her own credentials. She had likely set aside whatever professional ambitions she had possessed upon marriage, but from the unassailable social position of her husband's profession. Medicine carried a specific moral authority in post-war America that translated directly into social currency for his wife. She was connected, by association, to competence, to care, to a kind of civic virtue. Her opinions at the PTA meeting were heard differently. Her suggestions at the church committee carried more weight. When she indicated, through the subtle social signals available to women of her position, that something was or was not acceptable, the indication was received as something close to a ruling. She did not need to raise her voice. She rarely needed to say anything directly at all. The gradations below the professional tier were maintained with a precision that required constant calibration because the factors involved were multiple and sometimes contradictory. Income was relevant but not determinative. A salesman who earned well was not equivalent to a junior executive who earned less, because the executive's trajectory was upward and the salesman's was uncertain, and the suburb valued trajectory as much as current position. Stability mattered enormously. A household whose income was predictable and whose professional path was clear was a safer social investment than one whose fortunes were variable regardless of their current level. Education was a factor, though a complicated one, because a husband with a graduate degree in a lower status occupation occupied an ambiguous position that the hierarchy struggled to process cleanly. The women in the middle of the hierarchy, the teachers' wives, the managers' wives, the small business owners' wives, navigated their position with the greatest tactical sophistication, because the middle was the most dynamic, and therefore the most demanding. The top was stable, the bottom was fixed, the middle was in motion, and women in the middle were actively working their position, seeking opportunities to rise through social investment, community contribution, and the cultivation of relationships with women in the tier above them. This was not cynical. It was rational behaviour in a system where social position determined quality of life in direct and daily ways. The doctor's wife did not think of herself as a gatekeeper. The salesman's wife did not think of herself as excluded. The hierarchy was simply the social weather, present, consistent, never announced, and shaping every interaction that happened within it. For all its efficiency, the neighbourhood gossip network occasionally misfired, and when it did, the consequences revealed how much pressure had been quietly held inside the system. A secret shared to one person who shared it to the wrong person. A phone call overheard. A story that arrived at its target before the sender realized it would. In those moments, the network's invisible structure became briefly visible, and what it revealed was not malice exactly, but something older and more human. The accumulated weight of women who had very little else to control and who had built something extraordinarily powerful out of the few tools available to them. The misfire happened most often at the intersection of alcohol and social occasion. The dinner party that went a little longer than planned, the cocktail hour that was more generous than usual, the holiday gathering where the eggnog was strong and the inhibitions were correspondingly weaker. In those environments, the careful management of information that the network ordinarily maintained could slip, and information that had been held in appropriate confidence would move before it should, to someone it should not have reached, in a form that was less diplomatically encoded than the network's usual transmissions. A woman said something directly that she would ordinarily have said obliquely. A story arrived with its edges still sharp instead of the smoothed-handled shape it acquired through normal network processing. Someone was hurt who was not supposed to be hurt yet, or at all. The aftermath of a network misfire was its own social event, conducted with the same indirect intensity as everything else in the suburb. The woman who had transmitted the information incorrectly experienced a period of social anxiety that was palpable to anyone who knew the network's signals, an overwarmth, a slightly too eager contribution to subsequent social gatherings, a visible effort to demonstrate reliability and discretion that unfortunately highlighted the recent lapse. The woman who had been hurt processed her injury in the only way the suburb social language permitted, not through confrontation, not through explicit accusation, but through a calibrated cooling of warmth toward the transgressor that constituted both punishment and warning. The network self-corrected. These things always self-corrected. But the period of correction was uncomfortable for everyone involved and educational for everyone watching. What the misfire exposed, briefly, was the network's true nature, not the benign community infrastructure it presented as, but a high-pressure system carrying more emotional and social weight than its informal structure was designed to bear. Women who had almost no formal power had built a parallel system of influence and consequence that operated continuously and invisibly, and that system was under constant tension because the stakes inside it were genuinely high. Your reputation, your social standing, your children's social lives, your household's position in the community, all of it moved through this network every day. The pressure was real. The occasional misfire was not a malfunction. It was the system reminding you what it was made of. When you step back from the casseroles and the telephone trees and the party invitation lists and the quiet freeze-outs, you find something that resists easy judgment. The 1960s suburban gossip network was built by women who had been handed a very small world and chose to make it complex, navigable, and, in its own way, powerful. It was, depending on how you look at it, a mutual surveillance system, a mutual aid network, a social safety web, and an instrument of conformity all at once. It was where women exercised the only real influence available to them in a culture that had locked most of the other doors. It was not always kind, but it was rarely simple. The women who built and maintained the network were not, for the most part, small people doing small things. They were capable, intelligent, often highly educated women who'd been channeled by the economic and cultural arrangements of post-war America into a domestic sphere that was too narrow for their abilities and that they proceeded to fill with the same organizational energy, analytical attention, and social sophistication they would have brought to any professional environment. The coffee clatch was not trivial because it happened in a kitchen. The telephone tree was not trivial because it used a domestic appliance. The party invitation list was not trivial because it concerned social gatherings rather than corporate decisions. These were instruments of real power, operating in a real community, with real consequences for the people inside it. The fact that they were dismissed as gossip, as mere women talking, was a feature of the same cultural arrangement that had created the conditions for them in the first place. What the network gave its participants was agency, not the broad, formal, publicly recognized agency of professional life or political participation, but the narrow, intimate, densely operational agency of people who have mastered the available environment and learned to move through it with genuine skill. A woman who knew how to work the network knew things. She knew who was struggling and who could be relied upon. She knew where the social power was moving and how to position herself relative to it. She knew how to send a message without saying a word, how to withdraw warmth in a way that communicated consequence without inviting confrontation, how to extend warmth in a way that opened a door without making promise. These were real skills. They were acquired over years of practice in a high-stakes social environment. They were never credited as skills because the environment in which they operated was not considered serious. It was considered domestic. The legacy of the network is not the gossip. The gossip is long gone, metabolized into the past, the specific stories dissolved into the general texture of the era. The legacy is the women themselves, what they built, what they managed, what they endured, and what they understood about human communities that the more formally powerful world around them was too busy to notice. They understood that information is power. They understood that social warmth is a resource that can be allocated and withheld. They understood that a community's real life happens not in its institutions but in its kitchens, its pickup lines, its telephone calls, its careful silences. They understood all of this intuitively, practically daily, without anyone giving them credit for understanding it. They ran a parallel world inside the official world. They ran it with extraordinary competence, and they did it, all of it, before 9:30 in the morning, before the coffee had gone cold. Most of the suburb's information network operated entirely in the mind, stored, processed, and transmitted without a single written record. But scattered through every neighbourhood were women who wrote things down. Not in any official capacity, not in any document anyone would have called a record. In personal diaries, in the margins of recipe cards, in the small spiral notebooks kept in kitchen drawers alongside the scissors and the rubber bands. These women were the network's archivists, and what they left behind, when they left anything at all, was the closest thing the suburb had to a paper trail. The keeping of a personal diary in the 1960s suburb was a private act conducted in a community that had almost no private acts, which gave it a quality of mild transgression that its practitioners rarely acknowledged even to themselves. You wrote at the kitchen table after the children were in bed, or in the bedroom in the 20 minutes before your husband came upstairs, or occasionally in the car in the school parking lot with the engine running and the windows fogged. What you wrote was not addressed to anyone. It was addressed to a version of yourself that you could be honest with, in ways that the social environment did not otherwise permit. It was the one place where the performance stopped. What ended up in these notebooks was a record of the suburb's interior life that no coffee clatch ever produced. The observations were sharper because they were private. The assessments were more honest because there was no social consequence to honesty on a page that nobody else would read. Women wrote about their neighbours with a candour that would have ended friendships if spoken aloud, and also with a sympathy and complexity that the network's more public transmissions rarely allowed. The same woman who was discussed at the coffee clatch as a cautionary reference was described in someone's diary as lonely, as frightened, as someone whose situation the writer recognised too clearly for comfort. The diary held the version of events that the network could not afford to circulate. The recipe card margin was a different kind of archive, not deliberately kept, not intended as a record, but accumulating over time into a fragmentary document of domestic life that was in some ways more revealing than the diary precisely because it was unguarded. A note in the margin of a casserole recipe that said made this for the Robinsons when Jim left was not meant as history. It became history. The small spiral notebook in the kitchen drawer collected phone numbers, meeting times, reminders, and occasionally something that did not belong in any of those categories, an overheard sentence, a name with a question mark beside it, a date with no explanation. These were the traces of a mind processing information in real time, filing what needed filing, marking what needed marking, not for posterity but for Tuesday. What is striking about these private records, when they survive and can be read, is how fully they reveal the gap between the suburb's public face and its interior reality. The public face was pleasant, organised, and content. The interior reality was more complicated, richer in feeling, more honest about difficulty, more aware of the unnamed thing that Friedan would eventually put words to. The women who wrote things down knew what they were living inside. They knew it with a clarity that the social performance of daily life required them to set aside. The notebook was where they set nothing aside. It was the one room in the house that belonged entirely to them, with no picture window facing the street and no one watching from across the way. They wrote in it, they closed it, they put it back in the drawer, and in the morning the performance resumed. The suburb's information network ran on daylight hours. The morning coffee, the school pickup, the afternoon telephone call, the evening dinner party. But the suburb itself did not stop when the network went quiet, and the things that happened after dark in a community this tightly observed were not as private as their participants may have assumed. Arguments conducted at elevated volume behind thin walls carried further than people realised. Cars that left driveways at unusual hours were heard if not seen. The The suburb slept lightly and remembered what it heard in the night. Sound was the after-dark equivalent of the picture window. The post-war ranch house, built for affordability and speed rather than acoustic privacy, transmitted domestic sound with an openness that its residents learned to account for or forgot to account for, depending on the state of their composure at any given moment. A couple arguing in the kitchen at 10 o'clock on a Thursday was arguing effectively within earshot of at least 2 neighbouring households, both of whom would register the fact of the argument without necessarily catching the content, and registration was sufficient. The network did not need transcripts, it needed data points. A raised voice, heard through a kitchen window on a night when the weather was warm enough to leave windows open, was a data point that arrived in the morning's coffee clatch already formatted for distribution. The car that left at an unusual hour was a particularly rich source of after-dark information, because its departure was both audible and, to anyone who happened to be awake, visible. People were awake more than the suburb's cheerful daytime presentation suggested. Insomnia was common in a community where the unnamed problem ran through many of its households. Women who could not sleep lay in the dark, listening to the sounds of the street and absorbing, without intending to, the nocturnal movements of their neighbours. A car leaving at midnight and not returning until 3 was information. A car that left and did not return at all until the following evening was a story. The story would surface at coffee the next morning, introduced with the careful indirection of someone who had been awake and had noticed, and was now, in the spirit of community concern, mentioning it. The after-dark network was thinner than its daytime counterpart, less organised, less systematic, more dependent on the chance circumstances of who happened to be awake and what they happened to hear. But it fed the daytime network with a category of information that was uniquely valuable: the unguarded moment. Daytime behaviour in the suburb was managed, performed, calibrated to the community's social expectations. After-dark behaviour was not, or not as consistently, because after dark people believed they were unobserved and relaxed their management accordingly. That relaxation produced behaviour that was more revealing than anything the daytime performance offered. The suburb's daytime face was the story it wanted to tell. The suburb after dark was the story it was actually living, and the network, patient and comprehensive, collected both. In the 1960s suburb, the front lawn was never just grass. It was a statement, a signal, a carefully maintained public text that communicated information about the household behind it to everyone who passed. The condition of the garden, the state of the hedges, the presence or absence of seasonal flowers, the edging of the driveway border, all of it was read by the neighbourhood with the same attention a scholar brought to a primary document. Women who understood this, and most of them did, tended their lawns with a dual awareness, the horticultural and the communicative. You were not just growing flowers, you were publishing. The healthy, well-maintained front garden was the lawn's neutral state, its baseline message of "we are managing, we are here, we are participating in the shared project of neighbourhood appearance." It required consistent effort, which was itself a communication. We have the capacity for consistent effort, which means the household is stable, the woman is not overwhelmed, the domestic situation is under control. The garden was a daily performance review, conducted in full public view, with results that were read by every neighbour who drove past. Missing a week of mowing during summer was a notice. Missing 2 weeks was a concern. A garden that had visibly been abandoned was an alarm, and it would generate within days a casserole and a welfare check. Flowers carried their own, specific vocabulary. A woman who planted ambitious seasonal flowers, who changed her border displays with the seasons, who grew things that required genuine horticultural investment, was communicating something about her standards, her available time, and her household's stable enough conditions to support aesthetically motivated labour. A woman who kept a tidy but minimal lawn communicated efficiency, practicality, a household that met its obligations without excess. Both were acceptable. Both were read. The interesting cases were the gardens that communicated something unintended, the front bed that had been ambitious in spring and was overgrown by July, the seasonal display that was half installed and never completed, the lawn that was mowed irregularly in a pattern that suggested the mowing was happening in crisis intervals rather than as a managed routine. These were stories that the suburb read without being asked to read them. The backyard garden, less visible from the street, was where women sometimes grew things for themselves rather than for the neighbourhood, vegetable patches, cutting gardens, spaces that were tended for pleasure rather than performance. These private gardens were a small reclamation of domestic space, a corner of the property where the audience was not present and the tending was genuinely personal. Women who had them spoke of them differently than they spoke of the front lawn, with a warmth and specificity that suggested real attachment rather than the managed engagement of public presentation. The backyard garden was the one piece of the suburb's outdoor life that the network did not systematically read, because it was not easily visible, because it was not public, because it was one of the very few spaces that was genuinely hers. She grew what she wanted there. Nobody was grading it. Nobody was watching. It was, in a community almost entirely without them, a private thing. She went out to it in the morning before the day's performance began, and for a while she was just a woman in a garden, with dirt on her hands and nothing to communicate to anyone. Every neighbourhood in 1960s America carried inside it at least one open secret, something that everyone in the community knew, that had been known for a long time, that was discussed in careful encoded language among the network's participants, and that was never named directly in any public or semi-public setting. The open secret was not the network's failure. It was one of its most characteristic products. This suburb was extraordinarily good at knowing things and extraordinarily committed to the performance of not knowing them, and the open secret was the place where those two capacities met and learned to coexist. The open secret could be almost anything. A husband's drinking, managed within the household and visible to the neighbourhood in its effects, the car that drifted slightly at the curb on Friday evenings, the wife whose social presentations had a particular quality of controlled brightness, but never named directly in any conversation, a marriage that had functionally ended years before any legal process was initiated, maintained in the suburb's public life as a going concern while everyone who had watched it closely understood what they were looking at. A financial difficulty being managed through a series of small observable adjustments, a car that got older rather than replaced, a vacation that did not happen this year, a woman's clothing that had stopped updating in the ways it previously had, understood by the network and covered by it, without anyone ever acknowledging what was being covered. The mechanism that maintained the open secret was the suburb's investment in the appearance of harmony, which was deep enough and shared enough to constitute a genuine community value, rather than mere social hypocrisy. The appearance of harmony was not nothing. It was a shared commitment to creating an environment in which people could live alongside each other in relative comfort, which required that not everything true be said. The community understood this intuitively. It had developed, over years of close cohabitation, a collective sense of which truths required direct acknowledgement, and which truths were better maintained as open secrets, known, covered for, handled through the network's informal support mechanisms rather than surfaced and dealt with formally. The cost of the open secret was real and was borne by the person at its centre. To be the subject of a secret that everyone kept was to live in a peculiar isolation, surrounded by people who knew your situation and were choosing, out of kindness or social convenience or self-protection, not to acknowledge it. This isolation was different from ordinary loneliness because it was populated. You were not alone. You were among neighbours who knew everything and said nothing, which was its own kind of company and its own kind of abandonment simultaneously. Some women found the open secrets cover a genuine relief. The alternative, having the thing named and processed through the community's social machinery, was in many cases worse. Others found it suffocating, a daily reminder that the life they were visibly failing to manage was fully witnessed, and that the witnessing was wrapped in a silence that felt, on difficult days, less like kindness and more like a door that had been quietly locked from the outside. The suburb kept its secrets well. It kept them so well that the keeping itself became the secret. The 1960 Suburban Woman's Day was, on paper, fully accounted for. There was the morning routine, the housework, the grocery run, the school pickup, the children's afternoon, the dinner preparation, the evening social obligations. Every hour had an assignment. And yet, in the lived experience of women who were home all day in houses that could be cleaned and organised to standard in less time, then the day provided there was something that nobody talked about directly. Free time. Not much of it. Certainly not enough. But some. And what she did with it, that narrow, unscheduled, unwitnessed hour, was the suburb's most closely held private matter. The hour, when it existed, was typically carved from the mid-morning or early afternoon, after the visible domestic obligations had been met, and before the next scheduled demand arrived. It was not advertised. A woman who appeared to have free time in the 1960s suburb was a woman who appeared to not be doing enough, and appearing to not be doing enough was a social liability in a community whose entire organisational structure was premised on the fullness and importance of the domestic role. So the free hour was private, not hidden exactly, but not announced, conducted in the ordinary space of the house, with no special presentation and no external accountability. What women did in this hour was as varied as the women themselves, and that variety was itself a kind of portrait of the life that existed underneath the managed surface. Some read, not the approved domestic magazines, not the recipes and household tips, but novels, serious novels, the kind that assumed an interested adult reader who was thinking about the world rather than managing a household. Some wrote, in the notebooks and diaries that the network never saw. Some sat quietly, which sounds like nothing, and was in the context of a life with almost no genuine solitude, something closer to survival. Some called a friend, not a neighbour, not someone inside the network, but a friend from before the suburb, from college or work or another life, someone who knew them as something other than Tom's wife, or the Hendersons of the north end of the block. These calls were conducted in a particular tone, lower and more direct than the network's social calls, and they were the closest thing to genuine intimacy the suburb's social structure reliably permitted. The hidden hour was where the woman who lived inside the managed life occasionally surfaced and was, for a short time, simply herself. She surfaced without fanfare, without acknowledgement, without the network's awareness, and then she went back under, put the book away, rinsed the coffee cup, began the next thing, and the managed life resumed as though the hour had not happened. In a community where almost everything was observed, almost everything was communicated, and almost everything was known. The hidden hour was remarkable precisely because it was none of those things. It was the one hour that belonged entirely to her, conducted in the ordinary rooms of her ordinary house, invisible to the network, uncatalogued by the window woman, unmentioned at the coffee clatch. She did not talk about it. She did not need to. It was hers. In the 1960s suburb, in a life that had very little that was entirely hers, that was worth more than anyone outside of it could easily understand. And so, As the porch lights flicker on across the block and the last coffee cup of the day is rinsed and set to dry, we leave the 1960s suburb exactly as we found it, perfectly maintained on the outside, extraordinarily complicated on the inside, and watched from at least 3 windows simultaneously. These women were not small. That is the thing history has occasionally gotten wrong about them, and it is worth saying clearly before we close. They were not small women living small lives and filling the emptiness with petty concerns. They were capable, observant, analytically sophisticated people who had been handed a very specific set of circumstances and built something genuinely complex inside them. The network they created, telephone trees and coffee clatches, the casserole diplomacy and the invitation list politics, the long memory and the open secrets, and the one private hour in the kitchen with the book they didn't tell anyone about was not a symptom of limitation. It was a response to it. It was intelligence and energy and organizational talent finding the available channels and moving through them with the force of water, finding its level. Were they always kind to each other? No. The freeze-out was real. The rumour's mutation was real. The open secret's particular loneliness was real, and it was a loneliness the network sometimes created in the very act of trying to manage it. These were not angels. They were people. People under pressure, in a system that rewarded conformity and penalised difference, doing what people in those conditions have always done. Building structures of social control that protected some and constrained others, and were justified, sincerely and not entirely wrongly, as community. But underneath all of it, underneath the hierarchy and the surveillance, and the gentle, sustained pressure of the integration campaign, was something that deserves to be honoured before we go to sleep tonight. These women showed up for each other. When the casserole was needed, it was made and delivered, and the warmth in the hands that carried it across the street was real. When the marriage was visibly struggling, and the woman at the centre of it needed the story held together a little longer, the network held it quietly without being asked. When the unnamed problem surfaced in a kitchen conversation at a dinner party, briefly, encoded, deniable, the women around it recognised it, and their recognition was a kind of witness that the rest of the culture was not yet prepared to offer. They were living in the last years before everything changed. 1963 brought Friedan and the name for the nameless thing. 1964 brought the Civil Rights Act and the first serious legal language around equality. The decade would end with women beginning to move in numbers into the professional world the suburb had been built to keep them adjacent to rather than inside. The network would not survive. The transition intact. When women went to work, the coffee clatch lost its quorum. When women had careers, the telephone tree had fewer operators. When women had something else to do with their considerable capacity for attention, the block's interior life became less legible, less shared, less collectively managed. Something was lost in that transition, alongside everything that was gained. The community, the genuine, present, daily, accountable community of people who knew each other's routines and covered for each other's difficulties and showed up with food when food was needed. That community thinned. It has not been fully replaced. The group chat is not the coffee clatch. The neighbourhood app is not the window woman. Something that the suburb built, imperfect and constraining as it was, genuinely held people together in ways that are harder to find now. So tonight, as you settle into whatever comfort surrounds you, your bed, your couch, your quiet room, with no one watching from across the street, maybe spare a moment for these women. The ones who ran the network, the ones who were run by it, the ones who sat under the dryer at the beauty parlour and said something true, the ones who kept the private notebook in the kitchen drawer, the ones who carved out 1 hour in the middle of the managed day and spent it being quietly and without announcement themselves. They lived in a small world. They made it extraordinarily rich, and they did it, most of them, without anyone ever calling it what it was. The work of building and sustaining a human community, performed daily, without salary, without title, and without nearly enough credit. Sleep well. The lawn looks fine. Nobody's watching. Or at least, if they are, they haven't mentioned it yet.